There are a couple of things where we could continue, but I want to continue with the input container, which is the container around these inputs. So around the selected number text, around the text input here, and around the buttons. And this container has a width and it aligns the items, but as I described earlier, it would be nice to have that card look there. And for that, we need some more exotic styles, which sounds really fancy, but simply some style rules we haven't used before. For example, I want to add a shadow, a slight drop shadow. You do this with 4 core properties which you can use. A color, an offset, an opacity, and a radius. Now, a shadow color should be clear. It's the color of your shadow. Shadow offset is how much it's offset from your container, and that actually takes an object, which then in turn takes a width and a height. So you could say I want to offset the shadow by 2 pixels regarding the width and by 2 pixels regarding the height. That influences the 3-dimensional effect you're creating. Opacity describes how transparent this shadow is. If you set opacity to 1, then you have a totally intransparent, so a very visible, strong shadow. And if you increase that, or decrease that, I should say, if you set it to 0.1, for example, you have a shadow which you can barely see. Shadow radius then basically describes how sharp that shadow is, if it has rough edges, or if it's a bit more blurry, softer, things like that. So here I'll go with a shadow color of black. By the way, you can also use hex codes here if you want to, and you can also use RGBA codes if you prefer this, either normal RGB codes actually, or also with an alpha channel to describe transparency here, though the transparency here won't have a direct influence. For a shadow, you will have to set this with shadow opacity. For other colors, it would have an influence. But that's just a side note. Attached, you find a link with more details about how you can configure colors and which color values React Native accepts, because obviously that's way more exhaustive than what I can show here. I will just go with the name because, well, I want a black color, so why not go with that shortcut? Now, besides the color, the shadow here will also receive an offset. And as I said, offset here takes an object. Now, in case you wonder how I know this, for one, my IDE tells me. If I start typing shadow offset here, you see that hint I get on the right. You should normally be getting this as well. But in case you don't get this, the official docs are, of course, the place to go. And they are always under guides, components, and APIs. You can click on the view component there, or simply click on the API docs here in the top right corner, and then choose your view there. And there you'll find some style prop, and then you can find a list of all the view styles that are supported, and of course also how you configure those. And there, for example, you learn that shadow offset is an object with a number and a height. For the color, you learn that this takes a color, and that's exactly the link you find attached here, where it's described which kind of colors you can use. So that's just a little side note. Here, I'll use a shadow offset with a width of 0, but a height of 2, so that my shadow is offset a little bit to the bottom, so to say. Not so much to the right, so not at all to the right, actually. And I'll then also add a shadow radius, which is a number of, let's give 6 a try and see what that does. And last but not least, a shadow opacity of 0.26, which is relatively transparent, but which I think looks quite nice. In addition, I'll give my input container a background color of white to make sure that it's always white and not transparent, which is otherwise the default, so that if we would have another background color behind the container, let's say as the base color of the entire screen, the container here would always have a white background. Now with that, if you save this, you should see a shadow that looks something like this on iOS, but you see no shadow at all on Android, and that's not a bug. Instead, the shadow properties here only work on iOS. And that leaves one important question. How can you set a shadow on Android then? Is that not possible? It is, but there you have a special style prop, the elevation prop. This only works on Android, as the tooltip also shows here, platform Android, whereas the shadow properties only work on iOS. Now, elevation simply takes a number of, let's say, 5, and then use the default Android material design elevation. So you have less control there, but on the other hand, you get the default material design looks, which your users might be used to anyways. So that's the good thing about this. And now we also have a shadow here on Android and on iOS. On iOS, you will also notice that the shadow is visible on the left and right of the box as well, even though I gave this a shadow offset of 0 for the width. That can be controlled with the shadow radius though. If you set shadow radius to 0, then you see you only have the shadow where you defined its offset here. So you can make sure that the shadow really is only there where you want it. If you do set a shadow radius though, and by default there also is a default shadow radius, you get this spill effect, which is a more natural shadow after all. So here it's actually the effect I want. Now with that, I added a shadow both on Android using the default Android shadow and on iOS. By the way, on Android, you can of course change the elevation level to play around with different levels of elevation until you have the look you want for your application. You have enough shadow, basically. Now, besides having the shadow here, however, I think it would be nice to have some padding in this box now, because the items sit way too close to the edges. They sit directly on the edges after all. So to change this, I'll also add a little bit of padding here. And that will be a padding of 20. And again, that's a value you can experiment with to find the padding that you personally prefer and you think that looks good. And if we try that, now this looks way better. In addition, rounded corners would be a nice thing. So I'll add a border radius here of, let's say, 10 to have slightly rounded borders. If we now save that, this looks pretty sweet to me on both platforms, on both devices. So this is now the input container. We can't see the input and the buttons probably should have the same size as well, but at least the container is now looking good.